Thank you all for coming. So before we get to the thank yous and the feedback, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize Sebastian Lodeman. Sebastian was part of the EA community since 2016. And if you've attended EA Global before, you may have experienced Sebastian's warmth and altruism firsthand. My last time working with him was shortly before his unexpected accident when he volunteered at EA Global Boston. I was always struck by how sharp, energetic, and kind he was. I'm grateful for all of his work and for getting the chance to know him. If you'd like to share a memory or note about Sebastian for his family, and especially his young children, you can do so using the link on the slide. Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to take a moment to thank the people who made this event happen. First, our EAG team, Francis, Ivan, Arthur, and Izzy. Thank you. And a huge thank you to Laundry Yard, our event production team. This year is Kate's 10th year running EAG. 10th year, goodness, 10th time. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay, it's my 8th year, though. And of course, thanks to the volunteer team, the people in blue who've been helping you throughout the event. It's just really not possible to do these events without all of the work of these amazing people behind the scenes, so thank you. And this time, we experimented with going back to basics and had volunteer coordinators who were in charge of the whole time. So they were kind of leading different teams. We had our on-site volunteer coordinator, Hillary, her assistant, Alex, and our full-time volunteer team leads. So that would be Saul, Kyle, Allison, and Harriet. They worked tirelessly, genuinely throughout the event. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. So I look forward to reading all of your impact stories and feedback in the survey. So now the most exciting part of the weekend, we'd like you to take a moment to fill out the survey. That is my son, Charlie, user testing it for us. So this year, we did EAG GCR, as we've probably mentioned a bunch of times. And as Francis mentioned at the beginning, this is an experiment for us. So it's the first time in my 8 years running this event or being on the team that run the event, to do such a narrow conference. And we weren't sure, what the results would be. So that's your job now, to help us figure that out. Please let us know how you found it. Give us feedback on whether, it felt different, did it feel the same, how were the one-on-ones, serendipitous interactions, kind of anything that you can give us to help us make a decision about whether to do something like this again or go back to basics with the regular EAGs. So please take out your phone or laptop, and we're going to take about 10 minutes to do that now. So here's the link. And you can also find the link in SwapCard. We'll have sent it around.
We'll wrap the feedback there, but if you haven't finished, it'd be great if you could finish that and send it through. But woo, we've gotten to the end of the conference. I just want to do another quick thank you. I know several members of the CEA events team well, and I know they've put a huge amount of effort into this, as they do for all conferences. So maybe one more thank you to them. Great, so it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dan Zimmer for our closing talk of this EAG. For his session, The Swords of Damocles, a short history of jeopardizing humanity for economic expediency. So Dan Zimmer serves as a postdoctoral fellow with a joint appointment at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative. He draws on his Ph.D. in political science and training in science and technology studies to research the implications that anthropogenic existential risks carry for contemporary political thought. As a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them via Swapcard. We'll do a mix of pre-prepared questions and audience questions at the end. I think we should hopefully have at least 5 or 10 minutes for that at the end. There will also be office hours with Dan in room 208 straight after this session. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Dan Zimmer.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sim, and thanks to all of you for deciding to stick around for the last talk at the end of a long day with what could have been a somewhat taxing conference. These are heavy topics. I promise to keep it light for my talk. Just kidding, I'm definitely not. But you all knew what you were getting into. So with that, let's begin. In 1961, the US President John F. Kennedy stood before the United Nations General Assembly to declare, quote, "Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us," end quote. As we conclude this conference on global catastrophic risks, I believe that it's crucial to keep in mind that we are far from the first generation to be forced to contemplate this day, the day when the human habitability of the planet may be destroyed by human hands. My talk will address a few of the ways that the legacy of Kennedy's nuclear sword of Damocles may affect today's efforts to tackle global catastrophic and existential risks. It consists of 3 parts. The first will consider the composition of the nuclear sword of Damocles, foregrounding its underappreciated economic component. The second will explore a few of the psychopolitical consequences that may have come from being exposed to this apparatus. And the third will try to apply some of these lessons to contemporary plans to combat global warming through geoengineering. By way of a disclaimer up front, I should note at the outset that I'm telling a largely American story, but one that I believe has more general implications that can be applied more broadly. And so for part 1, let's begin at the beginning. In this case, that means casting ourselves back 2,400 years to the ancient city of Syracuse. It was here that the brilliant but paranoid tyrant Dionysius I took issue with one of his court flatterers. A man by the name of Damocles had just praised Dionysius for his unrivaled wealth and power and declared that he must truly be the happiest man alive. The tyrant then asked Damocles if he would like to experience a taste of this happiness. The Roman statesman Cicero recounts what happened next, writing, quote, "When Damocles said that he should like it extremely, Dionysius ordered him to be laid on a bed of gold with most beautiful covering, embroidered and wrought with most exquisite work, and he dressed out a great many sideboards with silver and embossed gold. There were ointments and garlands, perfumes were burned, tables provided with the most exquisite meats. Damocles thought himself very happy. In the midst of this apparatus, Dionysius ordered a bright sword to be let down from the ceiling, suspended by a horsehair, so as to hang over the head of that happy man. After this, Damocles neither cast his eye on the well-wrought plate nor touched any of the provisions. Presently, the garlands fell to pieces. At last, he entreated the tyrant to give him leave to go, saying that he now had no desire to be happy." End quote. As you can see from this account, the sword of Damocles comprised not just 2 components, but 3. The blade, the thread, and just as importantly, the bed of gold beneath. Each of these features bears direct analogy to the nuclear situation established by the United States in the 1950s. Firstly, and most obviously, there's the bright sword itself. This was forged of uranium, plutonium, and deuterium into an American arsenal that by the mid-1960s contained over 30,000 weapons. Then there is the horsehair thread that suspended the blade. Here too, the analogy is fairly obvious. In this case, it takes the form of the launch-on-warning nuclear command and control systems that still hang by a hair trigger today. Lastly, there is the part of the sword of Damocles that Kennedy neglected to mention, namely the bed of gold piled with exquisite luxuries. This image actually comes from the same Life magazine that contained the very first color photo of the hydrogen bomb. As you recall from Cicero's story, the bed of gold was not an incidental feature, but instead played an integral role in teaching the lesson that the apparatus was meant to impart. In fact, Cicero only recounted the story of Damocles in order to illustrate his own rhetorical point that, quote, "There can be no happiness for one for whom terror is always impending," end quote. This is important because the luxuries piled on the bed of gold proved to be an integral part of the American nuclear sword of Damocles as well. Having cost roughly $7 trillion to date, it is easy to see America's nuclear arsenal as a source of tremendous expense. It might surprise some of you to learn, therefore, that the United States initially manufactured the means to destroy the human habitability of the planet as a cost-cutting measure. It was not inevitable that, having invented the atom bomb, the United States would proceed to develop the hydrogen bomb, nor inevitable that, having developed the hydrogen bomb, the United States would proceed to mass produce it by the tens of thousands. Instead, as historians have noted, the Eisenhower administration of the 1950s came to fear that, when facing a Cold War of potentially indefinite duration, excessive military spending during peacetime could prove every bit as lethal to American freedoms and economic dynamisms as military defeat in wartime. Thermonuclear weapons offered what seemed like a deus ex machina at a time when, in the words of the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, the European nations and the United States were unwilling to commit exceptionally great funds that would have been required to counterbalance the Soviet tank force with tanks. Not only did each of these new hydrogen bombs detonate with as much as 1,000 times the yield of the device that leveled Hiroshima, but they derived most of that force not from rare uranium or plutonium, but the fusion of readily available hydrogen. As an administration official explained at the time, quote, "One can immediately see the great gain in economy over the primitive Hiroshima bomb. We can get our 20 megatons at the bargain basement price of $250,000. The same size of explosion with TNT would cost $10 billion, exclamation point," end quote. According to the US Secretary of State, relying on the deterrent threat of massive thermonuclear retaliation offered what he termed the modern way of getting maximum protection at a bearable cost. And yes, in case anyone is wondering, this is indeed where the origin of the American phrase, getting more bang for the buck, comes from. All this being said, these cost-cutting measures were not an end in themselves. When justifying this new policy of massive thermonuclear retaliation to the American people, Eisenhower explained how, quote, "Our approach to a position of military preparedness now makes it possible for the United States to turn more of its attention to a sustained improvement of national living standards. This economic growth is necessary to the welfare and indeed to the survival of America and the free world," end quote. True to his word, Eisenhower used the resulting defense savings to embark on socially transformative domestic projects, such as the Federal Housing Act of 1954 and the Federal Highway Act of 1956. As David Leonard has noted in his recent History of the American Dream, these and similar Eisenhower-era policies helped to radically reshape the United States into a highly suburbanized society, enjoying luxuriant material living standards never before achieved on a mass scale. By 1970, American rates of car ownership, fossil fuel use, and solid waste production had more than doubled. American GDP per capita, already the highest in the world, rose by an additional 60%. Sprawling suburbs unfolded in a dreamscape of limitless consumption served up on a bed of gold. By the 1950s, the components of the nuclear sword of Damocles were in place. By suspending the blade of massive thermonuclear retaliation over the golden bed of suburban mass consumption, the leadership of the United States had succeeded in jeopardizing all life on Earth for the sake of a high national living standard. With that, let us turn to part 2 and consider some of the psychological consequences that may have come from learning to live beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles. Here, I would like to begin by noting that Cicero never actually tells us what became of Damocles. He writes only that Damocles entreated the tyrant to give him leave to go, but never mentions whether this leave was granted. Because his is the only surviving account of these events, Cicero's curious omission leaves the fate of Damocles forever undecided. For my part, I'd like to believe that he was released. However, it would have hardly been out of character for this particular tyrant to have kept Damocles in place to better drive home his point, both figuratively and literally. At the same time, this uncertainty surrounding the fate of Damocles opens the opportunity for an interesting hypothetical. What would have happened, for instance, if the tyrant had refused Damocles' request to be released, but the blade never fell? What if, for all of his evil genius, it turned out that Dionysius had drastically underestimated the tensile strength of horsehair? What would happen if poor Damocles found himself ensconced in that murderous luxury for days, weeks, even years? How long would it take for his stomach to begin to knot and his toes to uncurl? How long would it take for him to be able to begin to nibble at the exquisite food surrounding him? How long until he could begin to actually enjoy those luxuries? Could he even someday, after months or years, come to take them for granted? And how then might he begin to relate to the sword overhead? Would he ever be able to fully take his eyes off it? Or conversely, might he eventually find he could barely perceive it at all? This may seem like a strange thought experiment to entertain. However, on closer inspection, it turns out to not be too much stranger than the actual history of the United States during the nuclear era. Back in the 1960s, Kennedy was only repeating a piece of popular wisdom when he claimed that the weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. At the time, it seemed obvious that, absent either some form of world government or global disarmament, the ongoing risk of accident, miscalculation, or madness would lead to nuclear disaster sooner than later. The only truly unthinkable outcome at the time is what actually happened, namely that despite dozens of documented near misses, humankind has so far managed to muddle through for the better part of a century without witnessing either nuclear disarmament or nuclear annihilation. At the same time, this in no way means that nuclear weapons have gone unused. In his final address to Parliament in 1955, Winston Churchill darkly remarked how, quote, "The hydrogen bomb has made an astounding incursion into the structure of our lives and thoughts," end quote. He nevertheless found a silver lining to the situation, holding out hope that once the capacity for mutually assured thermonuclear destruction had been achieved, then, as he famously put it, quote, "We shall by a process of sublime irony have reached a stage where safety will be the sturdy child of terror and survival the twin brother of annihilation," end quote. This was one of the first public articulations of the logic of nuclear deterrence, which sought to maintain what has recently been termed a fragile balance of terror as the best path to safety. As with the historical sword of Damocles, here too the production of terror is not an incidental side effect, but precisely what makes the apparatus so useful. Given that, let us now turn to consider what this kind of unexpectedly long-term exposure to nuclear terror may have done to those who first experienced it. Writing in 1965, the great American critic Susan Sontag vividly observed how, quote, "One gets the feeling that a mass trauma exists over the use of nuclear weapons and the possibility of future nuclear wars. From now on to the end of human history, every person will spend his entire life under the threat not only of individual death, which is certain, but of something almost unsupportable psychologically, collective incineration and extinction which could come at any time, virtually without warning. Ours is an age of extremity, for we live under a continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror." Given the scale of the mass trauma of nuclear terror, there turns out to have been remarkably little psychological research conducted on the subject. The American military commissioned several broad studies in secret for civil defense purposes. However, many of the civilian researchers who approached nuclear issues soon abandoned the topic because of the personal strain that it caused them. Nevertheless, those few researchers who persisted converged on a couple key themes. Firstly, and perhaps most unsurprisingly, excuse me, the early psychologists of nuclear anxiety reported a pervasive sense of futurelessness among their subjects. This futurelessness seemed to manifest most acutely in children and adolescents, some of whom resented being asked what they wanted to be when they grew up on the grounds that they no longer expected to grow up at all. Researchers found this sense of futurelessness accompanied by what one study called, quote, "a need to live in the present, with a nuclear threat contributing to teenagers' tendencies towards impulsivity and immediacy in personal relationships and behavior," end quote. The child psychologist Sybil Escalona reported that those she researched tended increasingly towards, quote, "focusing on the here and now and declining to invest energy and self-control in the attainment of distant goals," end quote. And yet, whether or not they expected the future to ever arrive, it was also noted that few of these young people ever fully gave up on life. As the psychologist Robert J. Lifton noted, quote, "We recognize in children, as in ourselves, a double life. Children preparing for adulthood, studying, and imagining marrying and having children of their own, but in another part of their minds, doubting that this will ever come to pass," end quote. Ultimately, constant exposure to nuclear terror seems to have fostered not only a sense of futurelessness, but with it a tendency to eschew long-term planning in favor of immediate gratification. A generation grew up experiencing a double life of both banality and terror, one that balanced sated suburban boredom with a threat of world-ending violence that could descend at any moment for any or no reason. Lifton coined the term psychic numbing to describe the resulting syndrome. This numbing amounted to a sort of acquired ignorance that permitted people to function on a daily basis by putting the prospect of annihilation firmly out of mind. Unfortunately, the biggest problem with psychic numbing, according to Lifton, is that it turns out to be a degenerative disease. In this case, the scar tissue that forms to insulate a particularly sharp psychic wound tends to spread, deadening as it goes. The sense of creeping numbing began to gather growing attention in the 1980s. In his 1982 study, The Fate of the Earth, the anti-nuclear political theorist Jonathan Schell, who got a shout out from Toby Ord earlier today, observed with particular clarity how, when confronting nuclear precarity, quote, "We are encouraged not to tackle our predicament, but to inure ourselves to it, to develop a special enfeebled vision which is capable of overlooking the hugely obvious, a special sluggish nervous system which is conditioned not to react even to the most extreme and urgent peril, and a special constricted mode of political thinking which is permitted to creep around the edges of a mortal crisis in the life of the species but never meet it head on. Before long, denial of reality becomes a habit, a dominant mode of life in our society, and unresponsiveness becomes a way of life. The society that has accepted the threat of its utter destruction soon finds it hard to react to lesser ills," end quote. 1982 also saw the aforementioned Escalona sum up her 2 decades of research on nuclear futurelessness in children by concluding, quote, Growing up in a social environment that tolerates and ignores the risk of total destruction by means of voluntary human action tends to foster those patterns of personality functioning that can lead to a sense of powerlessness and cynical resignation. By the same token, the development of those characteristics that can generate and support future-oriented collective social action is made more difficult in the present social climate. In short, I believe that growing up fully aware that there may be no future and that the adult world seems unable to combat the threat can render the next generation less well-equipped to avert actual catastrophe than they would be if the same threat existed in a different social climate, end quote. If there's any validity to these observations, they suggest that those who came of age beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles and began to enter into positions of power in the 1980s may have been almost uniquely poorly equipped to respond proactively to the discovery of another existentially dire but temporally distant catastrophe on the horizon. Unfortunately, that is just what happened. To see how, let us now turn to part 3 of this talk and consider how those raised beneath the nuclear sword of Damocles greeted global warming. Although the role that carbon dioxide plays in regulating Earth's temperature has been known since the 1890s, contemporary climate science only really came of age with the rise of computerized modeling in the 1970s. It was not until the 1980s that climate scientists felt sufficiently confident in their models to begin to voice the public alarm about looming warming. This mounting chorus of concern came to crescendo in 1988. It was during that year's unusually hot summer that the climate scientist James Hansen delivered his famous testimony to the US Congress, while over in Canada, a gathering of global leaders convened in Toronto for the landmark World Conference on the Changing Atmosphere. The then Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, opened the conference by declaring, quote, "As we near the end of the 20th century, humanity faces a crucial question. Will we devote our abilities, our energy, and our efforts to furthering short-term material well-being, or will we commit ourselves to enhancing life on planet Earth? For too long, we have neglected the fact that we have been playing lethal games with Earth's vital life support systems. Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, and globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war," end quote. These were dire warnings. However, in hindsight, they also look like a case of world historically bad timing. The Berlin Wall fell just a year later in 1989. Soon after, the Soviet Union disintegrated and the Cold War came to a close, taking with it the pervasive sense of imminent nuclear threat. By 1991, the elated editors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists pushed the hands of their doomsday clock all the way back to an unprecedented 17 minutes to midnight. It's currently 90 seconds to midnight, by way of comparison. For the first time, American consumers who had lived nuclear double lives for decades found themselves finally free to enjoy their beds of golden peace. What would happen if, just as the terror began to abate, you were to try to tell such people that they must now concern themselves with a new threat whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war? And what if you further told them that the brunt of these consequences would fall mostly on the grandchildren that they had never expected to have? Worse, imagine telling these people that the cause of this new threat was precisely the luxurious, materially profligate, energy-intensive consumer lifestyles that they now hoped to finally enjoy in peace. By 1995, the aforementioned Lifton began to observe what he termed, quote, "a merging of nuclear fear with other apocalyptic threats, such as environmental destruction and global warming," end quote. Unfortunately, anyone at the time who might have opted to ignore these apocalyptic warnings would have already had decades of experience putting similarly inconvenient truths out of mind. Now, to be clear, I do not bring this up to in any way try to absolve those who could have done so much more to blunt global warming during the key decades of the 1990s and 2000s for their failures to do so. However, I think it's equally important for both historical and strategic reasons to recognize that the generations who first confronted global warming were not fresh-faced apocalyptic newcomers, but the psychically scarred survivors of decades of nuclear terror. If they greeted global warming with all the numb indifference, constricted thinking, affective unresponsiveness, and cynical resignation that Lifton, Shell, and Escalona might have feared, then we have a right to be disappointed, but not surprised. Let me begin to wrap things up by addressing what some of this may mean for the present. So far, this talk has tried to make the case that several decades' worth of exposure to the nuclear sword of Damocles can help explain some of the shockingly numb and lethargic responses to global warming. Since those initial failures of feeling, it has long been taken for granted that when a sufficiently large number of people finally wake up from their stupor and take the crisis seriously, they will at last adopt appropriate mitigation measures. However, as I'm sure this audience well knows, those alive today have by now delayed far too long for mitigation efforts alone to keep the planet from warming by several degrees centigrade. Over the last decade, Earth system scientists have come to rechristen the economic boom of the Eisenhower years as the Great Acceleration. Seen in hindsight, this unprecedented period of growth not only built America's consumer bed of gold, but also marks the beginning of a sharp upward spike in every major measure of human impact on planetary systems. Already, the early effects of global warming and ecological collapse have begun to exert devastating impacts on the most vulnerable communities least responsible for causing these crises. However, as today's worsening fires, floods, and heat waves reach increasingly into the lives of the wealthy, the denial and apathy of recent decades has begun to give way to demands for immediate action. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the ongoing failure of mitigation efforts began to lead to a resurgence of interest in geoengineering solutions that could help to slow, stall, or even reverse global warming. Some of these techniques, such as the unproven capacity for carbon capture and storage at gigaton scales, are already built into the latest IPCC models as the only remaining way to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Other techniques, such as solar geoengineering, propose to reduce global temperatures by continually laying down a fine layer of reflective particles in the upper stratosphere. Advocates of solar geoengineering claim that their plans could cool the planet for fractions of a percentage point of the expected hundreds of trillions of dollars that will be required to implement mitigation, adaptation, and decarbonization strategies. Better yet, solar geoengineering also stands to offer the added benefit of decoupling global temperature from the composition of the atmosphere. This would in turn make it possible, in theory, to burn every last ounce of fossil fuel with relative impunity. One of the last survivors of the Eisenhower era, the aforementioned father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, took acute interest in solar geoengineering for precisely these reasons, proposing in a 1998 op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "If the politics of global warming require that something must be done, let us play to our uniquely American strengths in innovation and technology to offset any global warming by the least costly means possible," end quote. Although some may find this an appealing proposition, not everyone has been so enthusiastic. Opponents of solar geoengineering strategies, such as the eminent geophysicist Raymond Pierre Humbert, point out that these schemes, while cost-effective, would be profoundly dangerous, masking the symptoms of warming rather than addressing their underlying causes. Stratospheric solar geoengineering in particular risks prompting a sudden, sharp spike in temperature, the much-discussed termination shock, if such a program were ever abruptly curtailed. Pierre Humbert warns us that, quote, "The perilous state that such schemes would put our Earth into is analogous to the fate of poor Damocles, cowering under a sword precariously suspended by a single thread," end quote. For my own part, I believe that it would be unwise to render the ongoing habitability of the planet subject to the workings of a complex technical system that could break down at any moment through accident, miscalculation, or madness. It would be even more mad to create such a system not out of existential necessity, but as the most cost-effective way to perpetuate ecologically unsustainable, highly inegalitarian forms of mass consumer society. And yet, if you belong to a nation that has already purchased its incredible prosperity at the cost of total precarity, how much easier might it be to strike this bargain a second time? How appealing might it be to try and offset warming by the least costly means possible when you've already long since learned to live like there's no tomorrow? After all, if the leadership of the United States in particular were to decide to try and secure the country's continued economic growth by dimming the sun, this would only be the second time in living memory that they have knowingly placed all life on Earth in jeopardy for reasons of economic expediency. I would like to conclude this talk with an appeal to remember that those alive today are far from the first to confront the challenges of global catastrophic and existential risks. We are all of us the inheritors of a compounding series of failures weighed against one great success. On the one side of the scale, there's the fact that the nuclear sword of Damocles not only remains stubbornly overhead, but seems to be hanging by a slenderer thread than ever. The return of war to Europe, the emergence of China as a peer nuclear competitor, and the introduction of AI into nuclear launch systems all threaten to destabilize the fragile balance of terror. At the same time, the thermonuclear era precisely corresponds to that of the Great Acceleration. While the nuclear-armed Pax Americana may have brought peace and prosperity to billions, it did so by fostering a fundamentally unsustainable, fossil fuel-intensive model of economic growth. Whatever role nuclear weapons may have played in abetting global warming, the mounting economic, ecological, and humanitarian crises of an already warmed world now increase the risk of nuclear confrontation. And yet, as if the situation were not already complicated enough, those trying to pursue denuclearization in a warming world and decarbonization in a nuclear world must also begin to grapple with all the emerging risks detailed at this conference. Suffice it to say, we all have our work cut out for us. And yet, as I noted earlier, all this only rests on one side of the scales. On the other side remains the fact that, despite this cascade of compounding crises, we remain. Through some amalgam of wisdom, goodwill, good planning, and good luck, none of the global catastrophic and existential risks discussed at this conference have yet come to pass. There's a tremendous amount to be done to avert these catastrophes and a finite amount of time, energy, and resources to devote to doing so. Given all this, I would like to end with a call to action tempered by a dose of circumspection. When the next Edward Teller suggests using innovation and technology to offset global risk by the least costly means possible, ask that you remember that your cost-benefit analysis may be weighted by belonging to a society that has long since come to prioritize growth over survival. In a similar vein, there will be a growing number in the coming years who propose that their new geoengineering technique, synthetic organism, or machine learning system can avert global catastrophe with only a trivial chance of killing everyone in the bargain. It may turn out that some of these risks prove worth taking. At the same time, I ask that you remember that your own degree of risk tolerance has been shaped to some extent by a life spent passively trusting that the infrastructure of atomic annihilation will continue to hold. In sum, I ask that, when deciding what we owe the future in order to give what we can and do good better, we remain alive to the possibility that some of our priorities may bear the marks of the nuclear sword of Damocles. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Dan. I think we have time for about 5 minutes of questions. So it'll be great to hear how you got into this work.
Well, I got into this work like a lot of you, I imagine. This is something that just the sort of person that I am, I was kind of constitutionally incapable of not thinking about some of this stuff, but it always kind of lurked in the back of my head as a source of dread. And I actually found it highly therapeutic to begin to turn it into actual puzzles and problems that I could address in my work as an academic, and treat as rational problems, and also begin to realize that some of my own catastrophizing was perhaps not entirely warranted, and that there are more solutions out there than we sometimes are allowed to imagine.
Mm-hmm. Are there any ways in which you see the legacy of nuclear futurelessness playing out particularly strongly today?
That's a great question. One of the more surprising findings of my research is that there seems to be a sort of cyclicality to the presence of existential and catastrophic risks in public discussion. There was a huge boom in the topic in the 1920s following the First World War, and then in the 1950s during the initial confrontation with global fallout, the 1980s, a new nuclear panic, and then again in the 2010s. And it seems like each time it leads to slightly different forms of protest dynamics, different forms of extinction rebellion that have different degrees of staying power. And I very much hope that the movements that we've seen in the last couple of years, given the compounding number of crises that we're facing, will prove more enduring.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the thing that feels more present now is almost climate futurelessness. Like, I personally have friends who think, well, maybe I shouldn't have kids because the climate situation will be so bad. And do you foresee that happening with AI or other risks?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, among my students at Stanford, there's a sizable proportion who are full-blown AI doomers. They think about 18 months before some sort of artificial superintelligence paves over the planet in solar panels. At the same time, I think that that degree of panic, both whether it's climate or AI, can engender response risks. One of my biggest fears regarding global warming is not just a sense of futurelessness, but a willingness to potentially embrace technical solutions that, if they backfire, could prove much worse than doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. And do the different time horizons of nuclear and climate risk lead to different public receptions, in your view?
I think very much so. One of the surprising, well, I guess not surprising things about nuclear weapons that defined earlier eras of existential risk anxiety was that you really could put it out of mind, because there was a chance that even if you did nothing, the weapons would remain in their silos and nothing would happen. Whereas global warming, people are already beginning to experience the early effects of it, and there's just no way to put the brakes on this, that we already have a sufficient amount of warming built up in the system that even if you ignore it, it will not ignore you.
Mm-hmm. And for those looking to get into sort of your line of work versus maybe technical work or policy work, what would you recommend people do?
Oh boy, well, find a topic that you find really intrinsically valuable. During Toby Ord's talk, he mentioned that there are very few generalists. I aspire to be an X-risk generalist. I approach this from a largely historical perspective, and per Ord's point, there turns out to be a lot of really great work that's already been done in this. I dug deeply into the archives of the 1950s in particular. A lot of the philosophical existentialists, people like Hannah Arendt, Karl Jaspers, Gunther Anders, really did a good job of kind of anticipating a lot of the current governance issues, just kind of fundamental questions about how much do we weigh the value of human freedom versus human survival. And really, yeah, again, like I said in my talk, taking seriously the prospect that these are things that several generations worth of really smart people have thought about. But at the same time, given the kind of aversion to discuss these issues in public, a lot of that thought was never received at the time, or if it was promptly buried. So there's a ton of work to be done in excavating really great, immediately relevant thinking.
Yeah, and a great question. So are there any not written by me, that would be a bit, are there any counterexamples of catastrophic risks galvanizing societal action rather than inculcating helplessness? Because I guess you just do have this sort of reaction against nukes, and sometimes that causes people to take action, and that causes change. So yeah, where are the examples you see there?
That's a great question. And to be clear, there has been great public action, anti-nuclear protests during the 1960s, the 1980s, and they were very effective. We got things like the Limited Test Ban Treaty out of it, and removing Pershing missiles from Germany. So I think that is actually one of the big successes, although at the same time, the fact that we still have nuclear weapons also means that there is a risk of a sort of learned helplessness, almost, that it seems like, given the cyclicality that I mentioned earlier, almost every generation looks up, notices the nuclear sword of Damocles over their head, and realizes this is just insane. There's no reason that we should be doing this. They have large protests that do make some degree of incremental change, but they fail to remove the arbitrary existential threat to their lives, and then learn to live with it. But although, again, the fact that we're facing global warming, which can't be put back in the bottle, does mean that these dynamics change. I think there has been a lot of great movement around raising awareness through some of the Extinction Rebellion tactics to some extent, decarbonization, disinvestment, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned during your talk the doomsday clock, and that being at 90 seconds to midnight. Could you elaborate a bit on what that is? Because it gets a lot of press every time it's updated.
Yeah, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they thought it would be cool back in the 1950s, mid-century modernists, they could use 6 shapes to suggest a clock face, and they set the hands at 7 minutes to midnight because it seemed like it suggested urgency. And then, I think that was 1949, 1952, the first hydrogen bomb test, some wit had the idea to move the hands slightly to suggest that things had gotten even more dire. And so that's how things began, and that's why it's calibrated so close to midnight. But ever since then, they've been pushing it back and forth. And then I think in 2007, they began to add a couple gears behind the clock face to take into account ecological risk, and then 2015, technological risk. And that's when the clock hands really began to careen towards midnight. And I think they breached the 2-minute mark in 2020, maybe, to give themselves a little bit more granularity, because once you're at 1 minute to midnight, there's nothing else to do. And it's been holding steady at 90 seconds for better or worse. We'll see what happens. But that's yeah.
Mm-hmm. So on that cheery note, thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, please join me in thanking Dan for giving us our closing speech of the conference.
Thank you.